So our first set of notes for this unit on colonialism is Roman numeral 1, Pre-Columbian civilizations. And we're going to start off with a picture of a mound builder religious site. You can see on the top right-hand corner the Pre-Columbian natives. Those are natives before European contact. This is the mound builder culture, and they created a snake by piling up earth. And you can see in the top right corner the snake's head is eating an egg. Then it winds around to the bottom left-hand corner. Archaeologists aren't exactly sure why the Native Americans did this. You can only really see it from the sky. But we will find out that pre-Columbian civilizations, a lot of the information about them is going to disappear, so the only thing we have to understand their culture is archaeological evidence. And so let's start with Roman numeral A, migration. So how did Native Americans get here? The current theory that most archaeologists believe today is that Native Americans, from DNA evidence, came from Mongolia, Central Asia, East Asia, and during a period of glaciation, during an ice age, the Earth got colder and the glaciers in the North and the South Pole got much bigger as they sucked up the water, and consequently the ocean levels fell. They fell to such an extent that there is a small land bridge that popped up between Russia and the United States in the Bering Sea, and this is called the Bering Land Bridge. And you can see it in the map where you see this blue line going from Asia into North America. And because the ocean levels dropped, that exposed this very shallow area of the Bering Strait, and so we have this land bridge, and Native Americans wandered across it. They didn't know they were discovering a new continent. They were just following herds, looking for berries. And to them, they were just continuing their migration. They didn't know they had discovered a new continent. And then, as the Earth starts to heat up and the period of the Ice Age goes away, we will see that that land bridge will be submerged as the glaciers melt. And we'll see that these Asian hunters and gatherers, they're going to be trapped on this new continent of North and South America. And over time, they'll find their way through the glaciers and filter down into the rest of North America and eventually all the way down to the tip of South America. So that was about 10,000 years ago that archaeologists and climatologists think that Ice Age occurred, allowing people to move across on the land bridge. Another competing theory says that perhaps people from Asia built boats and they followed the coast, maybe in a second wave after the Ice Age, and they followed the coast and they were able to get from Russia through what will be Alaska and Canada down into North and South America by following the coast. Then a last theory is that in a much later date, some Polynesians were able to cross the Pacific Ocean. You can see on the bottom arrow, go all the way across the Pacific, island hopping from island to island, and eventually reach the coast of South America. And so we see that Asians and Indonesians were able to get to the Americas in waves over time, but for the most part, we think that the earliest wave was across the land bridge about 10,000 years ago. Next, diversification, number 2. And so as these Asians, now Native Americans, reached the Americas, they were able to, over time, spread out and move down North America into Central America and down into South America. And what would happen, archaeologists think, is that a tribe would go, and since there was plentiful food in this new continent, their population would increase slowly over time, and the tribe would get too big for its available resources, and so the tribe would split, going to look for new resources further away. That tribe would become successful again, split again, and so we see all of these groups of people become much more diverse as tribes continue to split and split and split as they slowly start to spread around North and South America, until we get to the point where right before Columbus comes to America in 1492, we see that we don't just have one or two groups of Native Americans, we have hundreds of different kinds of Native Americans, multiple cultures, and this is a major point that AP wants you to know, is that Native Americans are very diverse. So we're not going to study each and every single one of the tribes, and this is just some of them that are listed on the map, from the Illinois to the Shawnee, the Cheyenne, the Navajo, the Zuni, etc. So we're not going to study all of these tribes, but what we can do is group the tribes in, and this is what AP does. They group North American tribes into culture regions. And so the green area, that's the eastern woodland culture. Then we have in orange the Great Plains, and then we have in purple, we see the Pacific Northwest, kind of a lighter purple. And then we see in the darker purple Indians of what's called the Great Basin. It's the area between the plains and the Pacific coast. It's a very dry area. And then even drier, we go to the Indians of the Southwest, where you see the Hopi, the Navajo, the Anasazi, the Zuni, etc. And these Indians will live, these Native Americans will live in much different ways from one another, because all the Indians, Native Americans in green, they're going to live in a fairly lush area, and so they're going to live in a different way, in a different culture developed than the Native Americans in the Southwest that live in a desert. And so archaeologists and historians will tend to group Native Americans not just by tribe, but then by a bigger cultural area depending on their environment. And so what we're going to do in section B, the last section of these notes, is we're going to look at the major Native Americans that you could think about if you were to group them on that last map. And so first of all, we're going to start with the Hopewell culture. The Hopewell culture, if we look back, it's in the green area here, eastern woodland. And the Hopewell culture is primarily found along the Mississippi River Valley and the Ohio River Valley. You can see on this map. These Native Americans will live along these major river systems, and they will use the rivers to farm year-round. And so we see with all of this available food, because they're able to farm year-round, we're going to see pretty large-based cultures. Their culture is primarily based on raising maize, or what we'll call corn. And so they're dedicated, they're farmers, they're sedentary, they stay in one place, and they tend their farm all year long. And so because of that, they have available food supply, they have lots of water, and so we see their population increase dramatically. It increases so dramatically that they're going to be able to have a complex civilization. They're going to have permanent structures, they're going to have some of the farmer people be farmers, but since they're so good at farming, that'll free up other people who don't have to farm to be priests and warriors, government workers, whatever. And so we see large ceremonial complexes, societies like we do in the Mayans and the Aztecs in Central America. We'll see these large civilizations develop along the Ohio and Mississippi Valley. And they're called the mound builders because you can see they build these huge earthen temples that is just made of packed earth. From the first slide, we also saw them do that snake. And so we see these large ceremonial centers with earthen temples surrounded by villages. It's one of North America's, as far as we know right now, only complex societies. Almost all the other Native Americans in North America are going to be hunter-gatherers to some extent or another, and none of them are going to be living in quantities or in groups of this size. For the most part, really, the only other Native American civilizations that we know of outside of the mound builders are all going to be in Central and South America. So this is a little bit of a difference. AP also wants you to know that because they were such good farmers and they didn't have to have everybody farm, since they could create a food surplus, that we see social stratification. Like I mentioned just a few minutes ago, is we see that some people are going to be wealthy, some people are going to be priests and warriors and nobles, and other people are going to be poor farmers, slaves, etc. So we see a very complex hierarchical social structure. Then they're going to go away, and we don't know why. That's why there's a question mark there. Right before the Columbus came and the Europeans came, we're going to see that the mound builder culture disintegrates. We don't know why people just fled the mound builder temple centers. Perhaps it was a drought which made resources scarce. Perhaps there was lots of internal warfare. Maybe there was a natural disaster. We don't know. Maybe it was a combination of all of these things, but it will go away. And that's significant because when Europeans will come to North America, there will be no large-scale civilizations that can oppose them. When Europeans come to North America, they will be able to have an easier time conquering Native Americans because they're just a bunch of disassociated small tribes that are easier to conquer, as opposed to the Spanish, who are going to face, when they come across the Aztecs or the Incas, large-scale civilizations that can mount a defense. Next, we see Pueblo culture. So we're going to move to the southwest, which is the yellow part of this map. It's a very dry area. And so you would think that they wouldn't be very good at farming, but they are, because there are some rivers in this area. So it's a very sparsely populated part of what will be the United States. But there are some major rivers, the Colorado, the Rio Grande, etc. And so along these rivers, or smaller rivers that are tributaries, we will see that Native Americans will develop what the Spanish will call Pueblo culture. Since they're going to be primarily farmers, they're not going to be gatherers as much as, they're not going to be all that successful at gathering. berries and game and things like that because it's a desert and there's just not a lot of natural vegetation, flora or fauna that they can support their families with. And so they will resort to farming along these wet areas and a little bit of irrigation. And so we see them build permanent structures because they're primarily farmers and they have to stay in one place to tend their crops. So we do see people living here like the Pueblo culture in permanent structures, but they're never going to have a large-scale civilization because there's just not enough moisture and food to support a large civilization. So they live in these little towns, these little pueblos, where they can grow their corn, and they sometimes will live in areas where they can be protected, like on top of cliffs or in caves. But for the most part, they're going to live in flat areas near the rivers, building these adobe homes. The most famous one in Colorado we have of Pueblo culture is we see the cliff dwellers in southwestern Colorado, or the Anasazi. We see that they farmed on top of the mesa or on top of this mountain that you see here, this flat top mountain, and then for protection and defense in these large caves that we see, these kind of open caves, they would build their homes, these pueblos made of adobe, and then the cliff continues to drop off. So it's very hard to attack and easy to defend. And so we see these scattered throughout the Southwest as well. And so AP expects you to know, just as an example, you can put in an essay, what are these Pueblo cultures called? Specific tribes known as the Anasazi or the Hohokam. So we did, like I said, we do see them doing some irrigation to grow maize. Once again, maize is the major crop in North America. It's very dry, and so we see males and females both have to farm because I said hunting is very scarce. Next, we're going to slide over to the orange area on the map, and this is the Great Plains. This is where we live here in Aurora. And so we see this is a very flat area. If you look at the picture, there's not a lot of trees there. It's mostly grass because it's almost a desert. We get just enough rainfall and precipitation that it will not be a desert, but it's not enough to grow a lot of crops, and we're not going to see a lot of plants and animals besides large herds of buffalo. And so for the most part, the people on the Great Plains are not farmers. There's just not enough rainfall, and there are some major rivers, but for the most part, there's large swaths of the Great Plains where we're not going to see a lot of rivers, and so the people have to depend on, first of all, there's not going to be a lot of people living in the Great Plains, and we're going to see that the people who do live in the Great Plains, the Native Americans, they're going to have to primarily be dependent on hunting and gathering. Now, like I said, there's not a lot of animals that they can hunt and gather, but there are some, and some large grazing animals, and of course these are the American bison, the buffalo. And so we see that Native Americans in the picture, they will hunt coyote and wolves, and they will also primarily, though, hunt buffalo. Now, there were no horses in North America. They had long since been hunted out and become extinct thousands of years ago. And so Native Americans on the Great Plains had to walk on foot following the buffalo herds around. So for that reason, they're never going to develop permanent settlements, no large-scale civilizations, because they have to be mobile. They have to constantly pick up and move all their possessions in their homes all around to follow the buffalo herds. And they're not very successful hunters because these buffalo are large, powerful animals, and so they have to sneak up on them. And they do have bows and arrows, but it's going to take a lot of bows and arrows. It's going to take a lot of arrows to kill one of these buffalo, and it's very dangerous. And so the population of the Great Plains is going to be pretty low until the Spanish come. And when the Spanish arrive post-Columbus, they're going to bring with them horses, and some of the horses are going to get away from the Spanish. And eventually the Native Americans will domesticate these wild horses. And we see that unlike other Native Americans after Columbus, the population of the Great Plains Indians is going to explode because now they have this horse that allows them to hunt the buffalo much more successfully, and it'll be less risky. They can ride up, shoot a buffalo, and then ride away without getting stampeded or killed by the buffalo. And so we'll talk more about the Plains Indians later, but they are extremely dependent on the buffalo herds. And so we see after Europeans what I talked about, the population increase, and you can see by comparing those two pictures just how much easier it would be to hunt buffalo if you had the horse. And so we see that one of the tribes that you can put into an essay is the Sioux, also the Arapaho. These are Great Plains tribes that are living in this hunter-gatherer fashion. Males will hunt because they're going to bring in a lot of the food, and the females will gather. They'll look for things like choke cherries and berries of some kind, but for the most part, these people are almost completely dependent on the buffalo. The hide to make their teepees, the buffalo tongue obviously to eat. They use the bladder of the buffalo to hold water for themselves since they don't have pottery, and so everything they need is they're going to get from the buffalo. And like I said, they're also nomadic. They have to have these teepees. They have to move. They can't have permanent structures because they're constantly following the buffalo herd. So they live a much different way than the Native Americans on the green area of the eastern woodlands or in the yellow area of the southwest. Next, let's go back to the eastern woodlands, and we won't talk about the Hopewell because we already did, but let's talk about along the east coast. We will talk a lot about these Native Americans as we talk about the Pilgrims and Jamestown. And when the English arrive in Plymouth or in Jamestown, they're going to first encounter eastern woodland Indians in the green part of this map. It is almost at this point, right when the Europeans start to arrive, it is one large forest. All the area you see in green on this map is one continuous large forest. Of course, that isn't there today. Europeans have cut down most of the trees on their descendants, but it was all one big large forest, and so there's plentiful wood, which means there's lots of rainfall. The East Coast is a lot wetter than it is out here in the West, and so we see that their housing is made of trees. They have these long houses that are made of branches. You can see in the dark brown. And then they take bark off of the trees and they stretch them over the branches you can see in the light brown. So they have these long houses. So just like Plains Indians are impacted by their environment, what their house is made of, how mobile they are, we see eastern woodlands going to be impacted about their environment too, how they live. And so what the Indians or the Native Americans did in the woodlands is they engaged in slash and burn farming. So what that would mean is the Native Americans are going to farm because there's plentiful rainfall, and farming will help you get in a lot of food. And so what we'll do is they'll go into the forest, they'll burn part of the forest. That will create a rich, thick, fertile soil as all of that organic matter gets burned into ash and into the soil, and that'll allow the plants to grow. And it'll also get rid of all of the tree cover that was blocking the sun. And so we see this is good for the Native American farmers. But after about 2-3 years, the soil gets kind of depleted again, and so the Native Americans can't grow their crops there anymore because the soil is depleted, no more nutrients, and so they'll move to another area and do the same thing all over again, slash and burn farming. And so what we see is that the eastern woodland people are semi-nomadic. They stay in one place for 2-3 years, and then when they have to, they move on to a new place and stay in one place for 2 or 3 years. And so they're not as permanent as the southwestern Indians. They don't have these permanent homes like adobes, but they have semi-permanent homes. Next, the Native Americans in the eastern woodlands will engage in what is called three-sister farming. They have 3 primary crops that they're going to use. Of course, maize, we see in this picture corn, so they use that to grow. And then the corn will act as a trellis or something for the beans to grow up, because the bean is a vine, it needs something to grow up. And so these 2 crops will help one another. And then what we see is they'll also grow squash. Squash is the third of the 3 sisters, and the squash, like pumpkin, they have these big broad leaves, and that will shelter the soil around the corn and the bean and keep it from getting so hot and wilting in the hot summer sun. And so we see these 3 crops grow well together, they help one another, and it forms the basis of Native American diet on the eastern woodlands. For the most part, gender roles, what do males and females do? We're going to see that males primarily hunt because there are deer and there are elk and fox and etc., beaver that they can hunt. And so we see that the men will go out and do the hunting to get some of the protein for the family's diet, but the women will do the farming primarily. And so the women were gathering as well, so they know more about plants, and so they'll do the farming. And we'll see that it is a warrior society, but women have a great deal of influence in the society, more than any other Native American society, because even though the men go and hunt, the women that are farming actually bring in most of the calories. The men, when they go out to hunt, maybe they get a deer, maybe they don't. It's kind of spotty, but the women are always going to bring in the food because they know where it is. They're planting it and farming it. And so we see the women have a great deal of influence in the family and the culture because they bring in most of the food. Just like in today, if you have a mom and dad at work and your mom makes more money, she's going to have a lot more say in the family because the family is more dependent on her income. So here in Native American society on the eastern eastern woodlands, the family is more dependent on the woman to bring in the food and the calories. And so because of that, we'll see that when a man and a woman get married, it's the man lives in the woman's family's longhouse. And so he doesn't live with his own family like in other cultures. He goes and joins the woman's family. Also, women can get divorced. If she doesn't like her husband, when he comes back from a hunt, all his stuff's set outside the longhouse, and that tells him and the whole village that they're no longer married. She's put his stuff out on the front lawn, as it were. And so we see women have quite a bit of power in this culture. So again, we need some examples of Eastern Woodland culture or tribes that we can put on an essay. And so there's many: the Narragansett, the Delaware, the Wampanoag, the Powhatan. Here is one of the most famous one in the bottom right-hand corner, the Iroquois. And so we'll see that the Iroquois are a warrior society, and so it's still dominated by men, but still women have quite a bit of influence on what goes on. So generalities, this is our last slide. So we've talked about how Native Americans are varied, but in order for us to have some discussion of them, we have to put them in large groups. And so let's now put all Native Americans in one big group, just so we can talk about it in a survey kind of way, is that almost all Native Americans are clan-based. What that means is they live in small tribes, small groups that are related. So we have all these people who are extended families, moms, dads, cousins, aunts, uncles, cousins, those kinds of things, and they form a tribe. And so it's a small clan-based. And except for the Hopewell culture, that has to be this way, because if you live in larger numbers, the environment around you just cannot support that many mouths to feed. So that also deals with mostly small scale. Next, it's very communal. Living in such a way, in a prehistoric kind of way, it's very hand-to-mouth. In other words, there's not a lot of separation between being successful and starving to death. And so they're all in it together, as it were. And so if one person in the tribe has an excess of food, they share it with everybody else, because they know that someday in the future, maybe that family will be short on food. And so it is very communal, people supporting one another, not a lot of concept of private property, which is going to be much different than what we see the Europeans have. In addition to that, it's fairly egalitarian. Except for the Hopewell culture, it means that we don't have a lot of stratification in society. For the most part, a lot of Native Americans are nomadic, and so they're constantly moving around. And because of that, they can't accumulate a lot of wealth. You're not going to accumulate a lot of wealth and then have to carry it all over the place. And so we see people really can only accumulate as much personal possessions as they can carry. And so there's not a lot of difference between there's not a lot of difference between rich and poor in Native American society, because they're just too nomadic for that. Next, we see the religion of most Native Americans is animistic. They're always living out in nature, and so they're surrounded by nature, trees, deer, hawks, whatever. And so they assign nature spirits to these animals. They look at nature and they can see lessons to life and how to be moral. And so if you have a particularly good hunt, it's because the deer spirit allowed you to have it, and so you have to give thanks for that. This also helps Native Americans from overhunting their resources, because if they kill too many deer or pick too many berries clear, there won't be anything for the next year. And so they think that they have offended the nature spirit if you overhunt. Which was a way of keeping the resources plentiful around them. And so we see lots of animism. Again, this will come in conflict with the Europeans, who are very monotheistic when they arrive.